Hello, a very warm welcome to this special edition of our Cogit podcast series. My name is Anthony Richards and I'm the editorial director of Cogit. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Ed Husain. Now, Ed is a British writer and political advisor who founded Quilliam, a counter-extremist think tank. And he's also the author of The Islamist, published with Penguin in 2007, and The House of Islam, A Global History, published with Bloomsbury in 2018. Ed also took part in Cogit's important public event on combating jihadist terrorism in the UK, held at the Emmanuel Centre, London in September 2018, where Ed was in conversation with former Director General of MI5, Jonathan Evans. I'm very pleased that Ed has joined us today to talk about his new and important book, Among the Mosques, A Journey Across Muslim Britain, also published recently through Bloomsbury. Ed, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
A great pleasure. Thank you, Anthony.
Firstly, Ed, can I ask you at the outset, why have you written this book? What have been your motivations behind it?
I think the motivations are twofold. One is patriotic and the other, leading from that, is personal. First is that after the Brexit vote, I voted for Remain, and I felt that I didn't understand parts of the country where there was such a strong vote to leave. And my boss at the time, Tony Blair, who was three-time Prime Minister, sent on from Sedgefield, predominantly what we would call a white working class constituency, voted, I think, just in excess of 60% to leave the European Union. So I went up to Sedgefield and asked lots of people questions in small, what we would call perhaps focus groups in the language of the professionals, but they weren't really focus groups, they're just small groups of people who confided and opened up. And many thought that the presence of Muslims and mosques in their area was a real problem. Now, there wasn't a single mosque in Sedgefield, and for the couple of days I spent there weren't any Muslims, and yet there was this fear, this imagined fear. And when I probed people as to where this thought came from, they kept pointing towards Leeds, towards Manchester, and towards television programs. So I thought that fear should not be ignored. It needs probing. So that was the first reason, to better understand where that fear came from, what is actually going on in mosques and among Muslim communities outside of London. Because London, as you know, Anthony, is a kind of metropolitan hub, and you can quite easily forget your local identity and just merge into a much larger melting pot. And the second was, I have two young daughters, one's now 14 and the other one's 11. And I wanted to find out what their future would be like in a Britain if the fears of the people of Sedgefield were in any way true. So for both of those reasons, I went out there and literally kicked thought tires, if you like, to understand what attitudinal changes are taking place across the country.
Indeed, thank you, Ed. In your book, you raised the concern that we're becoming separate tribes with different and opposing identities, I think you refer them to as. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit further on that.
Yes, a great question, Anthony. I just, based on conversations, observations, and answers to many of the questions I asked, when people could not identify, for example, I write about a prominent mosque that I don't name, and a very influential imam with a large congregation in Bradford, who is considered by most people to be a moderate Muslim leader. And I mention him now because he wasn't alone. When I kept asking him questions about who he was, about his freedoms, about what his congregation sought from him, what he preached to them, the influence and the power that he had in Bradford and beyond. After everything, he kept saying, well, he said, we don't feel comfortable. And I said, what do you mean you don't feel comfortable? He said, can't you see it? Who feels comfortable here? And this is a man who's the most moderate of men. And I just couldn't understand what he meant by not feeling comfortable. And I kept probing, and it was, he could not sufficiently assert his tribal identity, which was a sense of his own group, a Muslim-only group. And similarly, when I went to speak with young working-class white men in the parks of Blackburn, they kept asserting the similar thing, we don't belong here anymore. And by we, they meant that working-class white identity. Similarly, when I met with young feminists in London, they kept asserting a similar discomfort because my point is across all denominations of demographics, there was this community or group identity put first and foremost, and that group being Muslim, being feminist, being gay in the case of people I met in Birmingham, or other identities, that was front loaded, that we were tribes based on these uncontrolled factors, and therefore we were not at home. What was missing, therefore, is a common glue that held all these tribes or emerging and imagined tribes that unless we bond them and bind them together, they will be at some point coming to a collision. So that was the tribal identity that kept coming up.
Yeah, thank you very much for elaborating that. You also identify three trends in Muslim communities that are of concern to you, and they're what you call communalism, clericalism, and caliphism. I wonder if you could sort of briefly summarize what you mean by those three concepts.
By communalism, I discovered, during the course of writing and researching this book, that there was this emphasis on the Muslim community. And I have two problems with that, because there is no such thing as the Muslim community. There are many, many communities. And secondly, this obsession with community seems to constantly disregard any conversation about country. And this is what worried me, that in many of those closed spaces, be they mosques or community centers, the country was a distant, remote, faraway place, but community was always something that was imminent and close and intimate. And so that's why communalism is a real problem, because it puts community before country, and loyalty then emerges to an imagined community. And that's the consequence of, say, putting Palestine before, say, Preston or Peterborough. And so that's the issue with communalism, that loyalty and identity is around the community. And when the community is imagined to be under threat, the individual constantly reacts. There's another problem with that. And that problem really is that when one member of the community does something wrong, all members are then blamed for it. And that's the wider issue of why Muslims constantly get blamed for terrorism, because too much emphasis is on the Muslim community rather than just being part of a wider British community. So that was the first problem. The second problem I identified in the book, as you say, is clericalism. And that's something I didn't expect, because I just thought most imams in mosque were powerless individuals, but they're not. And I say they're not because they have this undivided attention for a good hour or so every week. But on Muslim individuals, whether they wish to get married or divorced, or questions of funerals and indeed inheritance, the imams have a lot of say. So Muslim females, British subjects, are held hostage by the opinion of those clerics rather than British judges. So if a Muslim woman wants to get married, it's what the cleric says that matters. It's if she wants to divorce, it's the cleric's decision. And her inheritance and access to children is all decided first and foremost by a cleric. And that was really worrying for me, to see that clericalism was very much alive. And another reason why clericalism is emerging across the country and is a real problem is because on questions of homosexuality, on the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, it is the clerics who are passing judgment as to what is allowed and what is not allowed, and not the use of individual reason or what is indeed our inheritance, British liberties. Now, combined with communalism and clericalism, what unites both of these factors is a third factor, which you see, in book publications, which you see in events, and it is this: caliphism, the belief that somehow, someday, a caliphate will emerge somewhere again. In other words, a Muslim supremacist empire. Now, for all the faults of the British far right, I don't hear them talking about the need for the return of a British empire. But on the Muslim far right, you have this constant talk of the return of a caliphate, the return of a caliphate. And indeed, Shamim Begum and others who went out and joined ISIS as a caliphate, and hundreds of others from across Europe, that idea of the return to a Sharia-dominated, clerical enforced communal home, i.e. a caliphate, is a real issue. And for those who doubt me, I just refer you to the 42,000 plus individuals who are subjects of interest for the intelligence services here. Why? Because they believe in creating a caliphate somewhere out there, and in the absence of doing it out in the Middle East, These little communal caliphates are emerging in Dewsbury, in parts of Blackburn, Rochdale, Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham. So that's why those three things, communalism, clericalism, caliphism, should be of real interest to us as to what that troika will lead to in coming decades across the country.
Very interesting. Thank you, Ed. And also, I think you know that those who are calling for a caliphate are only successful in winning followers, I think you're suggesting, for their imagined utopia of that Islamic State, because, and I think this is a key point, because the majority community is unable to tell a more compelling story of why Muslims should have a stake in maintaining Britain as a pluralistic, tolerant, secular democracy. I wonder if you could elaborate further on what this compelling story is, and perhaps actually related to that, how a British identity can supersede those who would determine identity along race and religious lines, for example.
That is such an important question, Anthony, and thank you for asking it, because that really is at the center of the issue here. It's because there's a void, and it's because there isn't a compelling story coming out of our media, our universities, our government, our broader civil society. What you have then is, and it started with whether it was with Salman Rushdie in the 80s, or whether it was the Arab political asylum seekers who our government gave shelter to, successive both Labour and Conservative governments succor to, or whether it was after the 7th of July terrorism, or whether it was with the beginning of ISIS. There's been a constant pushing of Muslims are one community with clerics who must have their own caliphate. And unless that separatism is disbanded, destroyed, and replaced with a narrative that, to my mind, should be somewhere along the following: that Britain has welcomed in excess of 4 million, maybe up to about 5 million, we'll find out with the census coming up, Muslims as full citizens with full legal and other rights, in a way that no Muslim country has welcomed people from another faith background and awarded them those levels of rights and responsibilities. That's something to be proud of. Now, why did that happen? Why are Muslims freer in this country? And you go to Egypt, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Iraq, even Saudi Arabia. There are long queues outside the British embassies every day because there are millions more who want to come into this country. Why? Because it offers a sense of freedom, of liberty, and it gives rights which come side by side with the following part, which is always forgotten: responsibilities. Yes, you have entitlements, but you also have obligations. And those responsibilities and those obligations are built on the story. And that story goes all the way back to the Anglo-Saxon king Offa, who was doing trade with Muslim Emirates in the 8th century, or whether it was the English common law tradition that was negotiated with exposure to King John and Sicily, or whether it's Queen Elizabeth I and her trade deals with the Iranians and the Ottomans in order to bypass the Spanish and the French who were trying to boycott Britain, or whether it's indeed Queen Victoria, who was seen to be the Queen Empress, as Disraeli reminded her, of more Muslims in her territory than the Ottomans and others had in their territories, or whether it was Muslims dying side by side in the trenches with other people from the Commonwealth and indeed from England, Ireland, Scotland, and elsewhere, dying side by side for the freedoms that we've inherited. And the third and the last point on this, I think, is the philosophical strength that this country has. We are not like France that says, you must remove all religious obligations and commitments in the public domain. And if you celebrate religiosity, we will banish you from the public space. That is not the British way. Her Majesty is both the head of the church as well as the head of government. And I think that John Lockean tradition of tolerance and respect for each other's faith-based backgrounds, as long as the loyalty is to this land, and most importantly, we recognize secular law as the shelter under which we all have equal rights. The problem with caliphism is it doesn't recognize secular law. It wants its own legal system. The problem with communalism is that the bondage and the binding isn't with this country, but with an imagined future entity. And the problem with clericalism is that it doesn't place the human reason as paramount, but it places its own interpretation of revelation as what is most compelling for us to obey. So it's complicated, I get it, but I would summarize it with what I call rigor. As long as we place reason, individualism, gender equality, openness, the uniqueness of the British story, and racial parity, we will be fine, because rigor, or those ideals, at every point undercut caliphism and the call to terrorism. So our fight back must begin with ideals, better ideals, superior ideals, tried and tested values, over and above the fascism that's on offer from not just Iran, but ISIS and others who are now operating with proxies in large parts of these imagined communities.
Thank you very much, Ed. That's fascinating. You mentioned caliphism and the call to terrorism. I'm wondering, where is the place or the role for violence in all of this? Because, do you think that extremism and violence are part and parcel of the same problem, or should we be drawing a distinction between what's being called non-violent extremism and violent extremism? Do you think distinctions should be drawn between these two when we're trying to tackle these issues? So I guess, what is the role of violence in this context?
I've tried in this book, Anthony, to go upstream. And I think by the time the problem reaches violence, it's just too late. Because once someone's purchasing equipment for, whether it's a knife or whether it's buying substances for explosion, by the time it reaches that, it's too late. And it's already then in the hands of our blessed intelligence services and police forces and others who protect us every day and every night. And the burdens on them is already too high. I mean, as I said, in excess of 42,000 people are being monitored as we speak. So, and that will only grow if we don't get upstream. So I understand the debate between violent and non-violent extremism, but my response is no one becomes violent without the non-violent indoctrination and the non-violent preparedness for the violence. And often it is people who become frustrated because of the extremism that they take up the violence, because they realize that just expecting a caliphate, just being separate and just taking your orders from a clerical mindset isn't enough. They're not seeing the change fast enough. So guess what we do? We will take up arms and we will go and bring harm to others. And the reason why they attack other British citizens, whether it's the 7th of July or Ariana Grande concert or others, is because they don't see us as one people. They see non-Muslims as others. So I think all of the terrorism stems directly from the separatism and the extremism. And that's why going upstream is much more important culturally, politically, and from a policy and security angle.
Thank you very much again for that, Ed. Can I ask, how optimistic are you about the prospects for secular Islam in the UK?
I'm only confident and optimistic if the rest of us wake up. So far we have approximately 5 million Muslims. By the year 2050, there are projections to about 13 million Muslims. And there will be around 30 plus locations that will have Muslim majority. If we don't have the courage of our convictions to say, when in Britain, we all obey one law, we're in one land, we're one nation. Yes, we have racial, religious, sexual, and other differences. We celebrate those, but those ideas of reason, individualism, gender parity, openness, Britain's uniqueness, and racial equality are non-negotiable. And if we can stand by those values, that inheritance from past generations, and Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists, Hindus, Sikhs, all fought for Britain's freedom. So it is our inheritance collectively that we pass on to a next generation. If we have that confidence of making Britain the best it can be for a next generation, all of us collectively, then we're fine, because we have a common sense of inheritance, belonging, and looking to the future. But if we continue to ignore and allow for what's going on, say, in Batley now with the by-election, where we're seeing Palestine, Kashmir, blasphemy and dislike for the Labour candidate who happens to be lesbian being discussed publicly. I mean, if that's where we are as a country, If Backley is any indication of what's to come, then we are in a real mess going forward. Now, if on the other hand, if we can celebrate, I mean, look, I don't agree with Sadiq Khan politically, but he's been a great mayor for different causes and constantly trying to bring Britain and Britishness to the fore. And so that seems to me as a way forward. But if I had to highlight an example, Sajid Javid is a great sign of success. William Rees-Mogg, who comes from a Catholic background, is a great sign of success. Indeed, Boris Johnson, who comes from this Turkish, Greek, English, Russian. And I think that this is who we are. And it was Nietzsche who identified us as this nation way back in the 1880s, when he said even Shakespeare had this Moorish, Spanish, Saxon, English combination. So we are not calling to racial purity, because that's what Adolf Hitler made the mistake of doing. We are calling for an inclusive patriotism and love and loyalty to this country. And we can do it. If we wake up to it, we can do it. And that's why I am optimistic, because T.S. Eliot called us again and again not to give up on the West. You know, all the way from Socrates to Cicero to St. Augustine. There was constant fear about the decline of the West. But the seed to its success, the secret, is to remember that we can and we will self-correct. And this is the process of self-correction. What we're doing today now is waking up to who we are and then bringing more people on board, rather than allowing for separatism and extremism to fester in our midst.
Thank you very much, Ed. Very passionately put. Thank you for that. If I could finish off with a very sort of general question, really, what do you think from your research into this book and indeed your previous research? What do you think are the key messages that you would convey in terms of approaches to countering extremism, both now and in the future?
Firstly, extremism does not work. It fails. We've seen this again, and again, whether you're a failure as a family member or a failure as a citizen or a failure for your cause. Nobody succeeded in anything in life by being extreme. Secondly, extremism leads to terrorism, and terrorism leads to people such as Shamima Begum and others going out to join terrorist states. And guess what? They want to come back to Britain. And thirdly, save yourselves that perverted, distorted, deformed interpretation of one religion, and instead embrace the more enlightened, more pluralistic, more loving, more practical, more successful, both in this life and the next, version of mainstream, enlightened, personalized, pietistic form of Islam that goes all the way back to Ibn Arabi, Ibn Rushd, and many, many great Muslim scholars that helped the West become what it is. So there is a better way of being fully human and belonging to your countries with love and loyalty to future generations, rather than constantly looking for darkness and destruction.
Ed Husain, thank you very much for joining me today and for sharing your thoughts and your expertise with us. Thank you very much again.
Anthony, a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.